Hello everyone, I'm Chris Wehner, and today we've got a high-stakes hand played by none other than Upswing Poker's Ryan Fee, where he gets into a really tough river spot. We're going to run this hand through the solver and see what it likes to do in Ryan's spot, and beyond that we're going to look at a hyper-aggressive line that the solver finds in this hand that I think basically every human is missing from their game, so make sure to stick around for that. This is the third video of 4 leading up to the launch of mine and Dylan Weissman's Advanced PLO Mastery course, which we've been working on tirelessly for the last 6 months. So keep an eye out for that next week. That said, let's move on to the hand. All right, so here's the hand we're looking at today. Ryan is playing 3-handed PLO. He's in the big blind with King, King, 8-8 double suited. The action starts off with the button opening the pot, the small blind folds, and we go ahead and 3-bet out of the big blind. We're starting just a hair over 100 big blinds effective here, and we face a 4-bet from the button. Ryan goes ahead and calls this 4-bet, and we arrive at the 666 rainbow flop. I think as most people expect, we start off by checking here, and probably also as a lot of people expect who play PLO, we face a very small bet from in position here. We go ahead and call. Turn's not a very relevant card. We check again. We face another small bet, and we go ahead and call a second time. River goes ahead and bricks off. We check a third time, face a shove, and are in a tough position. So at this point, I encourage you to ask yourselves what you would do here and ask yourself if you would do anything different on any previous streets. Kind of set your expectations so that you know what you think you would do, and then let's compare them to what the solver's doing. So now pulling up the solver, let's see if Ryan made any mistakes. Starting off with preflop, we have a solved high stakes 6 max sim here. At 100 big blinds, we see that when the button opens and it folds to us on the big blind, we're unsurprisingly 3-betting all of our double suited kings, which Ryan does. And when we face a 4-bet from the button, we see that these double suited kings start to mix folding and calling. But if you remember, our specific combo was King, King, 8-8 double suited, and when we filter our double suited kings down to double suited double pair kings, we see that they're all calling the 4-bet, so Ryan's preflop play was correct. Blitzing forward and looking at our post-flop strategy, we see here that unsurprisingly, we are checking our entire range to our opponent, and when we give him the option to use the size that he did, betting 15% pot, he's betting his entire range. When we look at our response, we're folding a ton, occasionally calling, and when we look at the hand class we had, being pocket kings without an ace, this hand is a pure call. So Ryan does call, which is correct, and we move on to the turn. In this turn spot, unsurprisingly, we are again checking our entire range. Our opponent is again very frequently using a small size bet, so his play is good. And when we look at our hand class here, being these essentially naked pocket kings without an ace, we're still generally leaning towards calling. Some of these are starting to fold the turn, but the hand class as a whole is generally calling. On the river, we check and face a shove, and we find ourselves in this position where this hand class could really go either way. It's mixing. We're calling some, folding some. Since the people love definitive answers, if we look at our exact combination of King, King, 8-8, this hand is leaning fold. Let's see what Ryan does. So he's facing the river jam. We have a very indifferent combination that could go either way, and our hero ends up calling and actually wins this pot when he runs into a bluff from his opponent. When we look at how to think about these river defends, Munker has one really clear preference. A really easy heuristic to remember here is that all of your bluff catchers that arrive at the river that have an ace are going to be much more valuable than those that don't, and that's reflected in Munker Solver's strategy when we look at its bluff catchers here. About 40% of our range has an ace in it when facing this river jam, and we see that the solver is calling every single combination, pure continuing and bluff catching with those ace-x combinations. Whereas if we look at the portions of our range without an ace, we see that they're mixing about half and half and slightly leaning towards folding. So when we think about bluff catching this river, we should continue with all of our full houses that block pocket aces before we should continue with our better full houses that do not block pocket aces. So this isn't a spot where we just call all of our kings, maybe call some of our queens and fold the lower full houses, but rather we call all of those ace 9-9s and ace 10-10s and ace jack-jacks and ace queen-queens while starting to mix a lot of folds in without an ace blocker. So that was one example of how we can use solvers to analyze our play. We can look at a hand, we can look at a hand class, we can look at our river defends, all of those things that we just did in Ryan's hand. But solvers actually offer us more value whenever we look at more conceptual concepts that we can apply more broadly. So I have two concepts that I pulled out of this sim after doing all the heavy lifting for you guys that I'd like to share. One thing that happens a lot when you get into looking at solvers is you start to notice some trends. And one trend I've noticed is that in this flop position, we're the blue line here. We're doing very poorly. We are crushed by our opponent's entire range. His range has this whole region here that's like 70% of his range that has 90% equity, where he has pocket aces so often that we really can't compete with this. I think it's easy for all of us to understand and identify when we're at a big range disadvantage like this if we've played a fair amount of PLO in our day. One thing that may be less clear is how to respond whenever we're at that range disadvantage. So what the solver does here is whenever it faces a small bet and it knows it's in such a terrible position, its immediate priority is to rid itself of that awful position as quickly as possible, because the worst thing that can happen for it is it can find itself in the same quandary on the following street. So what the solver does here is it's at this terrible range disadvantage. It's facing this very small bet with very great pot odds. And nonetheless, it's still folding 80% of its range because it really wants to reposition itself so that on future streets, it doesn't have to deal with being in such a bad position. And we see that it successfully does that here, because after it folds 80% of its range on the flop, this is the new equity graph on the turn when we arrive at the 7 of hearts turn. And we see now that with the hero here as the blue line, we're no longer getting crushed everywhere. We're now actually winning at the top of range quite a bit, because we folded so often that this area of our range, which is the area that can beat pocket aces. You see our opponent's pocket aces equity has dropped steeply, being this red horizontal line. This area that can beat pocket aces has expanded from around 5% to around 35%. So about a third of our range now has either quads or sevens full. So why do we have this? What's going on? On the flop, our opponent has all the aces. We're getting destroyed. We need to reposition ourselves as quickly as possible so that we're competitive on the turn. Now, we can't magically make pocket aces appear in our range at high frequencies, so we have to find some other solution to this problem. And what the solver does is folds tons of its range so that when it arrives on this turn, it just has this new hand class that can beat pocket aces, being quads or sevens full, at a really high frequency. And now, when it finds itself in this position, it's no longer destroyed like it was on the flop. It's basically said, okay, I'm going to give up a lot on the flop. I'm going to fold a ton here because this is one of the worst flops for me. And then I'm going to be very competitive as we move forward. So that's one heuristic. When you find yourself at a range disadvantage, don't worry about fighting back. Don't worry about making sure you don't get pushed around, anything like that. But rather just try to reposition yourself as quickly as possible so that on following streets, you're much more competitive. Now, the second concept that we can learn a lot from in this sim is how to make the most out of that newfound position that we have put ourselves into on the turn here. Again, after overfolding the flop so much to rid ourselves of that terrible disadvantage so that we can be more competitive on the later streets as the pot is growing larger, we find ourselves now with this huge advantage where we have a hand that can beat pocket aces about a third of the time. Then we have these hands that have to bluff catch versus pocket aces with the remainder of our range. Some of them are better than others, and we see this decreasing slide of equity here. So how can we make the most of this situation? And this brings us back to the beginning of the video when I asked you, the viewer, to think if you would play any of the streets differently than how Ryan played, going check, call, flop, check, call, turn, check, decide, river. And getting back to that, we see here that when our opponent barrels the turn, I think everyone here is calling some quads, calling some good bluff catchers, and folding a bunch. Solver's not doing that at all. When it repositions itself like this on the turn, as we've described, it's not folding very often anymore. like it was on the flop, where it was folding 80% of the time, because now it's much more competitive. It's calling some, but I think to a lot of our surprise, it's shoving all in with almost a quarter of its range on the turn here. And that's not a very intuitive play at all. That's something we really have to think to figure out why it's doing that. And the answer is because it has so many of these hands that can beat pocket aces with like a third of its range here, it's able to shove some amount of those, put some in its check call range, and then take a lot of these low equity bluff catchers and shove those on the turn as well. So there's a general heuristic from the course that a lot of our bluffs want to mirror the cards that our value bets mirror. Here, since our value bets are largely quads, obviously our bluffs cannot have the same cards in our hand as our value bets, so we have to choose different bluffs. So it brings up the question, which bluffs should we use? And basically there are two hand classes of bluffs here that we're shoving all in on the turn with. One are hands that have some equity versus pocket aces when they get called. Hands like 9-9, 8-8 we see start to shove here because they have 4 outs whenever they get called by our opponent's aces. The other hand class that we're shoving is this hand class. If we look at our hands that have ace king high without a full house, this is going to remove some of our opponent's pocket aces from his range when we have an ace blocker. We see this hand class is shoving all in a lot on the turn here. So what we're doing is we're shoving some of our quads or sevens full, and also adding in a lot of semi-bluffs. Semi-bluffs being hands that have some amount of equity, like 10-10, 8-8 or 10-10, 9-9. And then also some good bluffs that have removal to our opponent's value range, hands that have an ace blocker that are not a full house. So the solver finds this really aggressive response here on the turn that all of us are missing as humans, and that helps it to force the in-position player who's trying to bet small here and take advantage of the middle of ranges here where his pocket aces are doing well. It forces him to interact with this top of range area that we're doing well. And that's very important, because if we don't play this turn aggression here, if we play just a pure folder call strategy, and we also don't play any crazy river aggression like open river jams, then our EV actually plummets. For the other solver nerds out there, this means we lose about 1.5% of the pot if we don't play any turn check raises or river leads. And that's unacceptable. We talk a lot in the course about how much we're willing to give up to simplify our strategy in various areas. This is not an area where we should be willing to give up 1.5% of the EV of the pot by playing strictly check call turn, check river here. So this is one spot where we can consider some alternate lines, and I think that's really where the value of doing a lot of this solver work comes from, is that it expands our minds to think about new possibilities. I don't think anyone is really check calling flop, check shoving turn here, but the solver has found a creative solution. It repositions itself so that it is in a very competitive spot on the turn with way over 50% equity and the literal nuts about a third of the time. And the best way for it to take advantage of that is to not allow the button to just keep leveraging his pocket aces region by betting small and only facing passive responses. So that's an area where I think we can all think more creatively, try to think of other spots where this is applicable, and start finding some of these turn jams here where we can really flip the equation on our opponent, and rather than facing indifference versus all of these small bets with our bluff catchers where we're really not generating any EV, we can entirely flip that by making our opponent face a balanced range when we shove all in, where he is now not generating any EV. If we shove all in and look at his pocket aces region, we see that most of them are calling, some of them are folding, but none of these aces are generating any real EV anymore. This hand class starts to approach indifference, and that's a massive win for us as the out of position player, because in this spot, if we just respond passively, our opponent's aces are going to generate tons of value versus our bluff catchers. They can just bet the turn, and then they can decide whether they want to barrel off on the river for value or if they want to take their showdown, depending on what the river is. So this is a solution to how we can stop our opponent from doing that. So do more solver work, think more about these alternate lines, expand your brains, and think more creatively. This has been one aggressive line that the solver found that no one else is finding, so I hope you enjoyed. If you enjoyed this analysis, make sure you tune in next week for part 4 of 4 in this series, where Dylan Weissman and I have a very special finale video coming that will most certainly translate into you making more money at PLO. This has been Chris Wehner. See you soon.